My beloved child, something shifted in a room where no one expected the truth to arrive so quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no carefully prepared speech, no perfect moment waiting for anyone. There was only a conversation that had gone on longer than it should have, a silence that finally became impossible to hide behind, and one person realizing that holding on was beginning to hurt more than letting go. The third party had been searching his face for an answer for some time, hoping that if they waited long enough, his uncertainty might somehow turn into certainty. But something was different this time. He was no longer looking for the easiest words. He was looking for the truest ones. And that difference changed the entire atmosphere. Don't skip, because the tears were not the most important part of what happened. The most important part came seconds before the third party turned away, when he finally said something he had apparently been resisting for far too long. At first, he spoke carefully. He admitted that he had tried to make sense of everything without hurting anyone. He had tried to convince himself that feelings could be reorganized, that distance could erase attachment, that choosing the calmer path would eventually quiet the part of him that kept returning to the same person. But every time he imagined his future honestly, one name kept appearing where another name was supposed to be. Yours. And when the third party heard enough to understand what he was really saying, their expression changed. There was disappointment, yes, but also recognition, the kind that arrives when someone realizes a truth was present long before anyone had the courage to name it. Then came the question that changed the conversation: is there still someone else in your heart? He did not answer immediately. That pause mattered. Because sometimes hesitation is not confusion. Sometimes it is the final moment before a person stops protecting everyone from what they already know. His eyes lowered. His voice softened. And instead of offering another complicated explanation, he finally admitted that whenever something meaningful happened, you were still the person he instinctively wanted to tell. When his day went wrong, he wondered what you would say. When something made him laugh unexpectedly, he imagined your reaction. When he considered where he wanted his life to go, memories of you did not feel like memories at all. They felt unfinished. Stay till the end, because what happened next was not about choosing between two people as if love were some simple contest. It was about one person finally becoming honest about the difference between companionship and connection. The third party looked at him and asked the question he had been avoiding even within himself: then why are you still here? And suddenly, there was nowhere left for him to hide. Not behind timing. Not behind circumstances. Not behind what other people expected. Not behind the idea that perhaps feelings would simply disappear if they were ignored long enough. He knew the answer. He had known it for longer than he wanted to admit. He had stayed because leaving one situation meant accepting what another connection truly meant. And accepting that truth required courage. There is something deeply human about delaying the truth when the truth asks us to change. He had not been trying to deceive anyone. He had been trying to delay a decision until the decision somehow made itself. But hearts rarely work that way. Eventually, what has been quietly returning asks to be acknowledged. And yours had been the presence returning again and again. Then the room became still. The third party wiped away tears, gathered themselves, and said something unexpectedly gentle: I think I always knew. Those words affected him more than anger would have. Because suddenly he understood that his silence had not protected anyone. It had only prolonged the moment everyone could already feel approaching. He apologized, not dramatically, not as a performance, but with the kind of sincerity that comes when someone realizes they should have spoken sooner. He said they deserved someone whose heart did not have to be persuaded into staying. And the third party understood. It hurt, but there was dignity in that understanding. They were not being defeated by you. They were being released from waiting for a love that belonged somewhere else. And then something unexpected happened. Before walking away, they asked one final question. If you could say one thing to the person you really love right now, what would you say? He froze. Not because he lacked an answer. Because the answer arrived too quickly. Something important is waiting for you, because this was the moment when everything he had carefully contained stopped fitting inside silence. He looked toward the floor for a second, as though seeing an entire history there, the conversations he replayed, the moments he misunderstood, the opportunities he let pass because he assumed there would always be another one. Then he lifted his eyes, and his answer was simple. You're the one I love. The third party did not need to ask who he meant. Somehow, they already knew. And that is when they walked away in tears. But listen closely to what those words truly revealed. He did not say, "You were the one." He did not speak about you like a closed chapter. He did not describe the connection as something beautiful that simply belonged to another time. He spoke in the present. You're the one I love. There is a difference between remembering someone and realizing that every attempt to move forward has only clarified what they meant to you. For him, that realization did not happen all at once. It had been forming quietly through absence, comparison, reflection, and moments when life became strangely empty despite looking perfectly normal from the outside. He had learned something people often understand only after distance: peace is not the same thing as emotional numbness. Familiarity is not the same thing as belonging. And choosing what seems simpler does not always make the heart simpler. Somewhere along the way, he had started noticing that the things he once considered ordinary about you were actually the things he missed most. The way you understood the meaning behind words he struggled to explain. The way conversations with you could move from light-hearted to deeply personal without feeling forced. The sense that he did not have to become a different version of himself to be understood. Those were not spectacular moments when they happened. That is why he underestimated them. But distance gave them weight. Suddenly, what he had taken for granted became impossible to replace. Have you ever wondered why certain connections remain emotionally vivid even after the noise around them becomes quiet? Sometimes it is because there was still something unsaid. Not necessarily a promise. Not necessarily a perfect ending waiting somewhere. Sometimes simply a truth that neither person was ready to hold at the same time. That is where he found himself now. Ready to hold something he had once been afraid even to name. But here is where the story becomes more interesting. After the third party left, he did not immediately reach for his phone. He sat alone. And that silence became the most revealing part of the night. Because for the first time, there was no one left to convince. There was no conversation to manage. No expectation to satisfy. No explanation to soften. There was only him and the truth he had finally spoken aloud. You're the one I love. He repeated those words quietly, almost as if hearing them from someone else. and something inside him settled. Not because every problem disappeared. Not because he suddenly knew exactly what would happen next. But because honesty had removed the confusion he had been carrying. He knew what he felt. The question now was whether he had the courage to do something respectful and real with that knowledge. His phone was sitting nearby. Your name was still there. He picked it up once, stared at the screen, and put it down. A few minutes passed. He picked it up again. This time he opened an old conversation. Not to romanticize the past, but to remember the last moment when things between you had felt uncomplicated. He scrolled slowly, and something caught his attention, a message from you he had read many times but never truly understood when it arrived. It was simple. You had told him that you never wanted him to choose you out of pressure. You only wanted honesty. He stared at those words for a long time. Because honesty was exactly what had brought him back to you. Not obligation. Not loneliness. Not someone else losing. Just clarity. And suddenly he realized something that unsettled him in the gentlest possible way. Perhaps you had understood him before he understood himself. Perhaps that was why you stopped chasing explanations. Perhaps that was why your silence had affected him more than arguments ever could. You had left room for the truth to reveal itself instead of forcing it to appear. And now it had. The next thing he did was small, almost invisible, but it carried more meaning than any grand gesture could have. He began typing a message. Then erased it. He tried again. Erased that too. Every version sounded too polished, too careful, too much like someone trying to control how they would be received. So he stopped. He closed his eyes and asked himself one question: if I only had one chance to be completely sincere, what would I need this person to know? His fingers returned to the screen. This time, the words came differently. He did not begin with excuses. He did not ask you to forget what had happened. He did not promise a perfect future. He wrote something quieter: I finally understand why nothing felt complete after you. Then he paused. There was more. Much more. But he had learned enough that night to know that truth should not be rushed simply because it has finally arrived. And there, beneath that unfinished message, another sentence was beginning to form, one that revealed what he had actually been afraid of all along. Not losing the third party. Not being alone. Not even facing the consequences of his choices. His deepest hesitation had always been connected to you. Because loving you meant admitting how much power the connection had to change the direction of his life. And once he admitted that, there would be no returning to the comfortable uncertainty he had been hiding inside. His thumb hovered over the screen. The message remained unsent. Yet this time, the hesitation felt different. It was no longer the hesitation of someone running away. It was the hesitation of someone preparing to finally step toward what they had been avoiding. And just before he added the next line, one memory of you returned so clearly that he stopped breathing for a second, not from fear, but recognition. It was something you once said to him that he had dismissed at the time. Now, after everything that happened that evening, those words suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. And what he remembered next may explain why his final message to you was about to become far more personal than, "You're the one I love." The memory came back so clearly that for a moment he forgot the message still glowing on the screen. You had said it during a conversation that seemed ordinary at the time, almost too ordinary to become important later. You told him, "I don't need perfect words. I just need to know when something is real." Back then, he had smiled and moved past it. He thought you were talking about reassurance, about communication, about the small misunderstandings that happen between two people who care deeply but do not always know how to say it. Now those words felt completely different. They were not asking him to prove anything. They were asking him to stop hiding behind complicated explanations when something simple had been true all along. And suddenly he understood why every message he had typed tonight felt wrong. He had been trying to make the truth impressive when what you had always wanted was for it to be honest. Don't skip, because this is where his unfinished message changed. He deleted the careful sentences. He removed the explanations he had been building one after another. He stopped trying to defend the past. Then he began again with words that sounded far more like him. "There is something I should have admitted sooner." He stared at that sentence. His heart did not race because it was dramatic. It moved because the words were finally accurate. He continued. "I kept thinking distance would make everything clearer, but somehow it only made one thing clearer: you mattered more than I understood when you were close." His thumb hovered above the screen again, yet this time he did not erase anything. He kept writing. He admitted that there had been moments when he nearly contacted you and stopped himself because he did not want to return with half-formed feelings. He admitted that he had replayed conversations between you, searching for the exact point when something changed, only to realize that perhaps the connection itself had never truly disappeared. What changed was his willingness to face it. And there was another truth he had never told anyone. During the time apart, he had compared almost everything to the way he felt around you. Not consciously at first. It happened in tiny moments. Someone would say something funny, and he would remember the way you laughed without trying to hide it. Someone would ask how he was doing, and he would remember how you somehow knew when "I'm fine" did not mean fine at all. A quiet evening would feel peaceful for a few minutes, then strangely incomplete, because he remembered how silence with you had never felt empty. These details embarrassed him at first. They seemed too small to explain why someone remained present in his thoughts. But eventually he realized that love is often recognized through the things that look insignificant from the outside. Not the grand scenes. Not the perfect speeches. The ordinary places where another person had quietly become part of how you experienced life. Stay till the end, because what he discovered next surprised even him. When he looked back at everything that had happened between you, he stopped asking, "Why couldn't I forget?" and started asking, "Why was I trying so hard to?" That question changed the meaning of the entire story. Maybe the problem had never been that you were difficult to leave behind. Maybe the problem was that admitting you still mattered would require him to acknowledge choices he had made while pretending he was completely certain. It would require humility. It would require accepting that sometimes people realize the value of something only after they create distance from it. And most importantly, it would require approaching you differently, not expecting you to simply reopen a door because he had finally found the courage to knock. That realization softened him. He did not suddenly believe that saying, "You're the one I love," gave him some automatic right to your attention. In fact, the opposite happened. The more clearly he understood his feelings, the more carefully he wanted to treat yours. He knew that whatever came next had to respect what you had experienced too. So instead of writing, "I need you back," he wrote, "I don't know what you feel now, and I won't pretend I do." Then another line appeared beneath it. "But I finally know what I feel, and I didn't want silence to keep speaking for me." He read the words twice. Something about them felt different from everything he had tried to say before. There was no demand hidden inside them. No expectation. Just honesty. And perhaps that is why he finally allowed himself to continue. He told you about the conversation that evening without turning the third party into a villain. He explained that someone had asked him a question he could no longer avoid. "Is there still someone else in your heart?" And he admitted that your name had risen inside him before he could invent a safer answer. He did not write every detail. Some moments were too personal to reduce to a message. But he wrote enough for you to understand that the words, "You're the one I love," had not been created for effect. They had come out because the truth had finally become simpler than hiding it. Then he stopped again. Something important is waiting for you, because while he sat there staring at your name, another realization arrived, one that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with timing. He remembered one of the last conversations you had shared. You had not begged him to stay. You had not tried to convince him that your connection was special. You had simply said, "Maybe one day you'll understand what I was trying to give you." At the time, he misunderstood. He thought you meant attention, affection, loyalty. But now he saw something else. You had been offering emotional safety. A place where he could be honest without constantly performing strength. A connection where uncertainty could be spoken instead of hidden. And because he had not been ready for that level of openness, he had mistaken comfort for something ordinary. Now he knew better. The rarest part of what existed between you was not intensity. It was recognition. You had seen him clearly, even in moments when he did not understand himself. That memory made him put the phone down again, but this time not because he wanted to escape. He needed to think about what it would mean to speak to you after everything. He imagined several possibilities. Maybe you would respond warmly. Maybe carefully. Maybe not immediately. Maybe you had changed in ways he had no right to assume. For the first time, he accepted all of those possibilities without trying to control them. Because real honesty does not guarantee the answer you want. It simply means you stop shaping your truth around the answer you hope to receive. And this was perhaps the biggest change in him that night. Earlier, he had wanted certainty before acting. Now he understood that sometimes the only certainty available is knowing what must finally be said. So he returned to the message. At the bottom, after everything he had written, he added one final sentence. "If there is still a conversation left between us, I want to enter it honestly this time." Then he read the entire message from the beginning. He removed one line that sounded too dramatic. He changed another because it seemed to place too much weight on you. He wanted the message to feel open, not overwhelming. Gentle, not urgent. Real, not rehearsed. When he was finished, he sat with it for several minutes. The room was completely quiet now. The earlier conversation felt far away. Yet one phrase remained inside him, repeating with surprising calm, "You're the one I love." He realized that when he said it aloud earlier, he had thought it was the ending of something. The ending of confusion. The ending of pretending. The ending of a relationship that had reached its natural conclusion. But sitting there now, he saw it differently. Those words were not only an ending. They were the beginning of responsibility. Because once you know what you feel, you have to decide whether you will treat that feeling with patience, honesty, and maturity or turn it into another impulsive moment. He wanted to do it differently. That was why he did not press send immediately. Instead, he opened one of the last photographs he still had of you. Nothing extraordinary was happening in it. You were simply looking away from the camera, caught in an unguarded moment. And unexpectedly, he smiled. Not because he was escaping into the past, but because he finally understood what the image represented. You had once been close enough to become familiar, and familiarity had caused him to overlook how meaningful that closeness actually was. Now distance had taught him what presence could not. He whispered something quietly, almost to himself, "Should have seen it then." But the sentence did not come with bitterness. It came with acceptance. People do not always understand important things at the exact moment they receive them. Sometimes understanding arrives later, after enough silence has cleared away the noise. And perhaps what mattered now was not how long it took him to understand, but what kind of person he would become after understanding. He closed the photograph and returned to the message. His thumb moved toward the send button. Then a notification appeared. He froze. It was not from you. It was a message from the third party. For 1 second he expected anger, another difficult conversation, perhaps a final question. But what they had written was far more unexpected. Only one sentence appeared on the screen: "If you really mean what you said about them, don't repeat the same mistake by being afraid to tell them." He read it twice. There was sadness behind those words, but there was also something surprisingly generous permission, perhaps not for the relationship, but for honesty. And that message affected him deeply because it removed the final excuse he could have used to delay what he already knew he needed to do. No one was asking him to rush toward you. No one was promising that everything would work out exactly as he imagined. But the truth was no longer trapped inside him. He had said it aloud. He had written it down. And now only one question remained: would he allow you to hear it too? His thumb returned to the screen. He took one slow breath. Then something happened that made him stop one final time. Just above the message box, he noticed a tiny detail in your old conversation, a sentence from you that he had completely forgotten. It had been sent months earlier, during one of your last honest exchanges. At the time, he had read it quickly. Tonight, it felt almost impossible to ignore. You had written, "If you ever come back because you finally know what you want, not because you're afraid of what you lost." His eyes stayed on those words. And suddenly the question was no longer whether he missed you. He knew he did. It was no longer whether he loved you. He had finally spoken that truth. The question now was deeper: was he reaching toward you because he feared losing you forever, or because he had genuinely become ready to love you differently? He sat there searching himself for the answer, and when it came, it surprised him. Because for the first time, he realized that what he wanted from you had changed completely. He was not thinking about getting the old relationship back. He was thinking about whether two people who had learned something in the distance could meet each other again without repeating the past. And that realization led him to change the final line of the message one last time into words you would never have expected him to say. He changed the final line because he suddenly understood that love was not supposed to sound like possession. It was not supposed to say, "Come back because I finally realized your value." It was not supposed to place the weight of his awakening onto your shoulders. So he erased the sentence he had written and replaced it with something quieter, something that carried no demand at all. "I don't want the old version of us back. If there is ever another chapter, I want to meet you there as someone who finally understands how to stay honest." He stared at those words longer than anything else he had written. They surprised him because they revealed the change taking place inside him. For so long, he had imagined reconciliation as returning to something familiar, restoring what had been interrupted, somehow rebuilding the exact connection that existed before everything became complicated. But now he understood that going backward would solve nothing. If there was ever another beginning between you, it could not be built from nostalgia alone. It would have to be built from what both of you had learned in the distance. Don't skip, because this was the moment when his confession became bigger than the words, "You're the one I love." Saying those words had revealed his feelings. What he wrote next revealed whether he had truly understood them. He continued typing slowly. "You never needed me to be certain about everything. You needed me to be truthful about where I stood. I see that now." Then he stopped and thought about all the moments when you had tried to reach him emotionally without asking for anything unreasonable. Moments when you had asked simple questions and received complicated answers. Moments when you had sensed distance and he had insisted everything was fine because admitting uncertainty made him uncomfortable. Moments when you gave him space, perhaps hoping he would use it to understand himself, while he used it instead to avoid deciding what he truly wanted. He saw those memories differently tonight. Not as evidence that everything had gone wrong, but as evidence that there had always been something worth understanding beneath the confusion. And for the first time, he did not blame timing, circumstances, or anyone else. He simply admitted that he had not been ready to meet the connection with the same honesty you had brought to it. That admission brought an unexpected calm. There was freedom in no longer needing to rewrite the past. He could not change what happened. He could only choose what he carried forward from it. Stay till the end, because what happened next was almost painfully simple. He pressed send. No dramatic music. No perfect certainty. No guarantee waiting on the other side of the screen. Just one small movement of his thumb, and suddenly the words he had kept trapped inside himself were traveling toward you. For several seconds, he stared at the screen as though expecting something immediate. Nothing happened. The message simply sat there. Sent. And this is where the old version of him might have panicked. He might have reread everything 20 times, wondered if he had said too much, considered deleting it, imagined every possible reaction. But tonight something was different. He put the phone down. He understood that your response belonged to you. His responsibility had been honesty. Yours was freedom. And somehow that realization made his feelings feel cleaner than they had in a very long time. A minute passed. Then another. He walked to the window and stood there quietly, thinking about the third party leaving in tears. He felt sadness about that too. Not guilt for loving someone else, but regret that truth had taken so long to arrive. He hoped they would eventually understand that walking away had not meant losing to you. It meant making space for a relationship where they would never have to wonder whether someone's heart was somewhere else. And he understood something else: kindness does not always look like staying. Sometimes kindness is finally being clear enough to stop asking another person to wait for feelings that may never become what they deserve. That thought remained with him until his phone lit up. His entire body became still. Your name appeared on the screen. But there was no message yet. Only the small indication that you had opened what he sent. He stared at it, then deliberately looked away. He did not want to turn your reading into another form of pressure, even privately. Still, somewhere beneath the calm, he felt the weight of the moment. You were finally reading words he should have said much sooner. You were learning that while he had seemed distant, confused, perhaps even emotionally unavailable, something inside him had been moving toward clarity. And then 3 little dots appeared. A reply was coming. They disappeared. Returned. Disappeared again. He smiled faintly because he knew that hesitation. How many times had you both carried entire conversations inside silence because neither knew how to make the first sentence simple enough? Something important is waiting for you, because when your response finally appeared, it was not the emotional declaration he might once have hoped for. It was only 5 words: "Why are you telling me now?" He read them carefully. There was no anger in the sentence, but there was history. There was caution. There was the quiet voice of someone who had learned not to open their heart just because beautiful words arrived late. And strangely, he respected you more for asking. Because the question forced him deeper than, "I miss you." Deeper than, "I realized I love you." Those answers were true, but they were not enough. So he did not rush. He sat down again and asked himself what had truly changed tonight. Was it simply the ending with the third party? No. That conversation had only exposed something already present. Was it loneliness? No. If anything, he felt calmer alone than he had felt while avoiding the truth. Was it fear of losing you? Partly, perhaps. But fear had existed before, and fear alone had never made him honest. Something else had happened. He had finally stopped viewing love as a feeling that should automatically tell him what to do. He had started seeing it as something requiring responsibility, clarity, and courage. So he answered you with the most accurate words he could find: "Because tonight I realized I was using confusion as a way to avoid being vulnerable. And I don't want to do that anymore." He sent it without editing. Your reply came faster this time. What does that mean for me? That question hit him differently. Because once again, you were refusing to let his realization become a burden placed onto you. And he understood exactly why. So he typed, "It means you don't owe me anything. I only wanted you to finally know the truth." There was a long pause after that. He wondered whether the conversation might end there. And if it did, he knew he would accept it. That was perhaps the clearest proof that something in him had genuinely shifted. He was no longer reaching toward you simply to receive reassurance. He wanted to tell the truth even if the truth did not immediately give him what he wanted. Then your next message arrived, and what truth is that? He almost laughed softly because there it was, the opening he had wanted and feared at the same time. He could have repeated the words he had already spoken earlier. "You're the one I love." But he sensed that you deserved more than a dramatic sentence separated from its meaning. So he wrote, "The truth is that when I pictured a life that felt emotionally honest, you were still in it. Not because I need you to rescue me from anything. Not because someone else walked away. Because every time I stripped away fear, expectations, and pride, my feelings kept leading back to the same place." He paused, then added, "Back to you." Your reply did not arrive immediately. Several minutes passed. And in those minutes, he began remembering the very beginning between you. Not the complicated ending. The beginning. The first conversation that lasted longer than either of you expected. The first moment he realized he was telling you things he rarely told anyone. The way being around you had felt strangely natural before either of you tried to define what it meant. That was what he had spent so much time trying to understand. Maybe the connection had frightened him precisely because it had not required effort to feel meaningful. He had trusted struggle more than ease. He had assumed that something comfortable could not possibly be profound. And now he saw how wrong that assumption had been. Your next message came quietly. "I cared about you deeply. But I can't go back to uncertainty." He closed his eyes for a moment. Those words could have frightened him once. Tonight, they felt fair. More than fair. He answered, "I'm not asking you to." And then came the sentence that changed the entire tone of the conversation. "You wrote, then what are you asking?" He looked at those words for a long time. This was the moment where he could either repeat old patterns or step into something entirely new. He did not ask for another chance. He did not ask whether you still loved him. He did not ask you to forget the hurt or promise him a future. Instead he typed, "One honest conversation." Nothing more than that. No pressure. No promises we haven't earned. Just two people saying what they actually mean. The reply took longer this time. Long enough for him to begin accepting that maybe you were not ready. Long enough for him to set the phone beside him and breathe. Then the screen lit again. Tomorrow? One word. Yet somehow it carried more possibility than every dramatic sentence he had imagined. He stared at it, almost afraid to give the moment too much meaning. You were not saying everything was fixed. You were not saying the past had disappeared. You were simply leaving a small door open for truth. And maybe that was exactly what both of you needed. He responded, "Tomorrow." Then he placed the phone down and smiled, not with the excitement of someone who believed everything was suddenly guaranteed, but with the calm of someone who finally understood that the next step did not need to contain the entire future. One conversation was enough. One honest meeting. One moment where neither of you had to perform certainty. And somewhere across the distance between you, perhaps you were looking at the same quiet screen, wondering whether the person who had once struggled to name his feelings had truly changed enough to stand behind them. That question could not be answered by tonight's words alone. He knew that. Words could open the door, but only consistency could show what stood behind them. And as he prepared to sleep, one final realization settled over him. The most meaningful part of "You're the one I love" was not that he had finally said it. The most meaningful part would be what he did after saying it. Tomorrow would reveal whether those words were simply an emotional confession born from a difficult night, or the beginning of a completely different way of loving you. And when the two of you finally came face to face, the first thing you said was not what he expected at all. When you finally stood in front of him the next day, you did not ask whether he still loved you. You did not mention the third party. You did not even bring up the message that had kept both of you awake longer than either would admit. You looked at him with a calmness he had not prepared for and said, "I need to know what is different this time." The question landed more deeply than anything dramatic could have. Because suddenly he understood that saying, "You're the one I love," had been the easiest part. This was where the truth had to become visible. He took a slow breath, searching your expression, perhaps expecting to find the version of you he remembered, the one who would soften first, reassure him, make the conversation easier. But you were different now. Not colder. Not distant. Simply more grounded. You had learned that caring for someone did not mean abandoning your own clarity. And strangely, seeing that change in you made him even more certain that this conversation mattered. Don't skip, because his answer was not what you expected. He did not say, "Everything is different." He did not promise that he would never make another mistake. He did not reach for perfect words. Instead he said, "The difference is that I'm not standing here asking you to trust what I feel. I know I have to show you what I do with it." Something inside you shifted, but only slightly. You had heard beautiful sentences before. You knew that emotion could make people sincere for a moment. What you needed to understand was whether this realization could survive ordinary days, uncomfortable conversations, and moments when certainty did not come easily. So you asked him another question. "And what happens when you get scared again?" He looked away for a second. That question carried history. He knew exactly what you meant. Fear had not always made him leave physically. Sometimes it made him withdraw quietly. Sometimes it made him become vague when you needed clarity. Sometimes it made him pretend he needed more time when what he really needed was courage. He could have defended himself. Instead he said, "Then I tell you I'm scared," instead of making you guess what happened. The simplicity of that answer surprised you. And perhaps it surprised him too. Because he was beginning to understand something important. Maybe the connection had never required him to become fearless. Maybe it only required him to stop hiding whenever fear appeared. Stay till the end, because the conversation that followed did not feel like two people trying to recreate an old love story. It felt like two people meeting again with all the illusions removed. You told him that there were nights when you had wondered whether you imagined the depth between you. You admitted that his silence had made you question things you once felt certain about. Yet you also told him something he was not prepared to hear: "I never needed you to choose me over someone else. I needed you to choose honesty over avoidance." His eyes dropped immediately. Those words reached directly into the heart of everything that had happened. The third party had walked away in tears, yes. He had spoken the words, "You're the one I love." But sitting across from you now, he realized the true choice had never been between two people. It had been between continuing to live behind emotional hesitation and finally becoming honest enough to stand inside his own feelings. That realization changed the atmosphere. He leaned forward slightly and said, I know saying this now doesn't erase how long it took me to understand. You watched him carefully. Then you replied, I'm not asking you to erase it. I'm asking whether you learned from it. There was no hostility in your voice. That almost made the question harder. Anger might have given him something to defend against. Your calmness left him alone with the truth. So he told you about the night before, not every detail, but enough. He explained how the third party had looked at him and asked whether someone else still occupied a place in his heart. He told you how your name had arrived inside him before he could formulate an answer. He told you about the tears, the goodbye, and the final unexpected message encouraging him not to make the same mistake again by staying silent. You listened without interrupting. Then you said something that stopped him completely. I'm sorry they were hurt. He had expected curiosity. Maybe even relief. He had not expected compassion. But that was you. Even after everything, you did not need another person to lose for you to feel valued. And in that moment, he remembered one of the reasons he had never truly been able to replace the connection. Your heart did not measure love through competition. You wanted something mutual, chosen, and clean enough that nobody needed to be diminished for it to feel meaningful. Something important is waiting for you, because your next words changed his understanding of the entire situation. You said, if we ever try again, I don't want our beginning to be their ending. He looked at you, uncertain what you meant. You continued, I don't want this to become a story where someone walks away and suddenly we run toward each other because emotions are high. If there is something here, I want to know it exists when everything becomes quiet again. He sat back slowly. That sentence contained exactly the wisdom he had been missing. The previous night had been emotional. Important, yes. Revealing, absolutely. But you were asking whether his truth would remain after the intensity faded. After the shock disappeared. After the words stopped feeling new. He nodded and said, then we go slowly. You almost smiled. Slowly? He nodded again. Slowly enough that neither of us has to pretend. For the first time since the conversation began, the tension softened. Not completely, but enough for both of you to breathe. There was something unexpectedly beautiful about not trying to decide everything in one meeting. Neither of you needed to name the future. You only needed to understand the next honest step. So you began talking not about grand plans, but about the moments where things first started becoming unclear. He admitted that he sometimes mistook emotional intensity for a warning sign because he had grown accustomed to keeping certain parts of himself guarded. You admitted that when he withdrew, you sometimes tried too hard to understand what he would not explain, and eventually that exhausted you. He looked at you and said quietly, you shouldn't have had to decode me. You answered, no. But I also shouldn't have assumed I could love you into being ready. That sentence remained between you for several seconds. It carried no accusation. Only understanding. And suddenly the past did not feel like evidence that you had failed each other. It felt like two people finally seeing where they had both been trying to create certainty before they were equipped to sustain it. Then something small happened. He laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because he remembered how impossible he once thought this conversation would be. You looked at him and asked why. He said, I spent months imagining what I would say if I ever sat across from you again. None of this was in the speech. You smiled faintly. Good. He raised an eyebrow. Good. You nodded. Maybe we don't need speeches anymore. And there it was, the first moment when the old warmth between you resurfaced naturally. Not forced. Not nostalgic. Just familiar enough to remind both of you that beneath all the complexity, there had once been an ease that neither had forgotten. Yet neither of you rushed toward it. That mattered. He did not reach across the table dramatically. You did not offer immediate reassurance. You allowed the moment to be exactly what it was, a small sign that something gentle still existed underneath everything that had happened. Don't skip, because just when the conversation seemed to be settling into peace, you asked the one question he had secretly hoped you would never ask. When you said, "You're the one I love," what did you actually mean? He became silent. The words sounded simple when spoken the night before. Now, with you sitting directly in front of him, they carried an entirely different weight. You continued, "Did you mean you love the memory of me? The way I made you feel? Or me, the person I am now, even though you don't fully know who that person has become?" He looked at you for a long moment. And that question changed him again. Because he realized that part of loving someone after distance is accepting that you cannot simply return to the version of them stored in your memory. You had grown. You had changed. You had built parts of yourself without him there to witness them. If he truly loved you, he would have to become curious about who you were now instead of expecting the person he remembered to appear exactly where he left them. So he answered, "I think last night I meant the person I remembered. Today, sitting here, I realize that isn't enough." You stayed silent. He continued, "I love what I knew of you. But if you let me, I want to learn who you became when I wasn't there." Something in your eyes softened. Not surrender. Not certainty. Recognition. Because that answer did not try to trap you inside the past. It gave you room to be new. And perhaps that was the first moment you truly considered that his realization might be deeper than regret. He was not simply asking for his old place back. He was asking whether he could earn a place in the life you had continued building. The distinction mattered more than he knew. You leaned back and asked, "And if I'm different?" He smiled gently. "Then I meet the different you. And if I need time? Then you take time. And if I don't know what I feel yet?" He paused, then answered, "Then you don't have to know just because I finally do." That was the sentence that broke through the final layer of tension between you. Because for once, his certainty was not demanding yours. His feelings were not becoming a deadline. You were free to discover your own truth at your own pace. And that freedom made the conversation feel safer than any promise could have. Stay till the end, because what happened when you finally stood to leave revealed more than anything either of you had said. He stood too, uncertain whether the moment should end with a hug, a handshake, another conversation scheduled immediately, or simply space. He did not decide for you. He only said, "Thank you for coming." You nodded. Then, just before turning away, you looked at him and said, "I believed you last night." His expression changed. He had expected you to say you needed proof. You continued, "I believe that you meant, you're the one I love." I just didn't know whether that meant you finally understood love or whether you were simply feeling loss." He swallowed quietly. "And now?" You looked at him for another second, almost as though choosing how much truth to reveal. "Now I think maybe you're starting to understand the difference." Then you walked away. He remained there, watching you go, but something was different from the night before. When the third party walked away in tears, he had felt the weight of an ending. Watching you leave now did not feel like another ending. It felt like space where something could grow without being forced. He did not chase after you. He did not immediately send another message. He let the conversation breathe. And in that quiet, he realized something he had never understood before: love did not always need immediate closeness to feel real. Sometimes love looked like respecting the distance another person needed while still remaining emotionally consistent. For the rest of that day, he carried your final sentence with him. "Maybe you're starting to understand the difference." He wondered what you had seen in him that made you say that. Was it the way he stopped defending himself? The fact that he did not ask you for an answer? The willingness to meet who you had become instead of chasing who you used to be? Perhaps it was all of it. But what he did not know was that your conversation had affected you too. You had walked away appearing calm, but your thoughts were moving quickly. Because there was one thing you had never told him. During the time apart, there had been a moment when you almost reached out. A moment when you had written a message, stared at it for several minutes, and then deleted it because you believed he had already chosen a different path. You had never told anyone exactly what that message said. And now, after hearing him speak with a clarity you had once hoped for, the words of that deleted message returned to you almost perfectly. That evening, you opened your phone, found his name, and began typing something you had never expected to say. Not, "I forgive you." Not, "I still love you." Something much more revealing. And when his screen lit up with your message later that night, the first sentence made him realize that while he had spent all this time believing he was the only one carrying an unfinished truth, you had been holding one too.